So we're really going to get into the meat of this work here. We've gone very, very, very deep in a philosophical, ontological way in terms of the possibilities of baseball as a cultural mechanism or a cultural artifact, right, which is representational. It shows the body in space and in time, critically performing acts or feats of what we would call existential heroism to reveal the fundamental essence of the will in space and in time, as in revelation or realization of the powers of being. So beyond this quality, right, which you might say is salvational at the level of a metaphysics of humanity or the essential nature of humanity, we're dealing with far more practical circumstances as it pertains to meaning and being in time, which is to say political economies and exploitation. So this is, to me, again, the real history of baseball and where this whole project started as a labor history, right? A labor history of Cuban native individuals and communities, a labor history of American black individuals and communities, and a labor history of American European immigrants and poor white sharecroppers in the early modern era of American history, which intersects directly with the foundational rise of baseball as America's primary cultural artifact and pastime. So we're looking at a real destitution. And in correlation with that real destitution in terms of economic impoverishment, political chains, in many cases total enslavement of the individual, if not profound states of indentured servitude, such as sharecropping in the early American South, and mining and industrial factory work in the American North. We're looking at, in correlation with that destitution, the absolute essence of a real project of meaning emergent in space and in time through these political underclass groups, which is to say a freedom project, a liberation project in terms of meaning in the everyday, which can necessarily be practically inserted in and interjected into this paradigm of absolute political destitution as in enslavement. And this, again, is the historical and political condition of vast groups of people across space and time, which could simply be termed the political underclass of civilizations, those who lay the stones in which the bureaucracies corrode social systems, social networks, social policies from within to make profit, right, or to generate wealth or to generate class distinction. And this has long been a ground for political rebellion and revolution, which is the overturning of civilizations as they inevitably become corrupt from within. Right? This is, again, a human existential condition, which we discussed explicitly in the last essay, as a failure to realize the essential powers of the will and to remain within an aperture of the will which is based upon power, violence, consumption, production, and reproduction as the unconscious somnambulistic will as it is programmed into the genetic organism or the genetic individual as an animal in space and time. This is a failure of revelation. So baseball must function as a ritual extraction from the destitution of American civilization. This is a destitution of the everyday, which is explicit, a lived, emergent political reality of the everyday in the American underclass. And this is something that is so fascinating to me about the story of Dizzy Dean and Satchel Paige in relationship, because these are two men who effectively come from the same place in the same time, as in the absolutely destitute, poor, agrarian American South. And you see some really beautiful pictures of them together across this racial boundary, which has been long established in American civilization and American culture and society, especially in this very, very, very contracted Jim Crow era, specifically in the American South, where it is at its most violent and most explicit. Dizzy Dean and Satchel Paige breaking this political and social color barrier, as we discussed with Jackie Robinson in 1947, even 15 years prior to that. So we have to understand here, 10 or 15 years, I would say, we have to understand here the revolutionary powers of baseball as living within this civilizational complex, which is America, which is a state of class warfare against the poor white sharecropper or the indentured immigrant miner in the North, as we discussed with Jake Daubert and Stan Kovaleski and Lefty Grove. This is a political project of the underground. We went into this a little bit with the black baseball as political underground, as well as in Cuba, and we went into this deeply with mining and with Dizzy Dean. So we've laid the framework and the foundation and the grounds of different case studies and examples of this phenomenon, but we have to understand and merge together the existential quality and value of baseball as a metaphysical problem to be solved, which is the power of the will being realized through the individual and the organism. We have to merge that existential metaphysical project with the economic, historical, material, political realities of the everyday from which it emerges, which is to say, the meaning-making project, which is essential beneath and under this power mechanism, which is the utter destruction of lives, right? If you read any one of Satchel Paige's biographies, you understand, especially in his familial relationships, right, in his ancestral lineage, as with Dizzy Dean and countless other of these baseball players, it's very clear, and this has been cataloged in the civilizational and cultural archives of American baseball history, as well as in Cuba, as we discussed with Alejandro Ohms. We're looking at a destitution, Ohms coming from a very, very, very poor sugar mill town in Cuba. These players themselves, right? It's so easy to get caught up in the milieu and the distraction of the what is considered to be the surface of baseball history, which is the statistics, the events that occur within the cultural context of baseball as a microcosm within these civilizational archetypes and architectural models in which the human is conceptualized and implemented. We're looking at the same ritualized power dynamics of the creation of the class of the destitute, which there's something deeply within the story and the narrative of Christ and the teachings of Christ that is within a real understanding of baseball history in Western civilization and the Western Hemisphere proper, in relation to, again, this meaning-making project and the necessity of it to emerge from these absolutely impossible situations of political, economic, and social destitution in which the human is actively erased. The human is impossible, or the human is made into a laboring mechanism or labor machine. And so much of what I find so beneficial and important and powerful about Karl Marx is not actually within any of his specifically manifesto-style work, but it is rather in his analysis of alienation and the labor machine, in which slavery and the labor of a servant or in servitude becomes so fundamental that the laborer becomes so thoroughly identified in and with labor as in the machine of the body that this is perceived of as and in love. So this is a relational context or a relational status which is replicated across capitalist civilization and society, including in romantic relationships, social relationships, the entirety of the terrain of the real in capitalist society, especially in modern hyper-accelerated industrial capitalist society, which we experience in America and from which baseball emerges and becomes a powerful meaning-making system, is entirely submerged within and into and unto this construction which is to say, laboring body for a profit outcome or material outcome or productive outcome, which is to say all possibility for relationship or humanity is submerged within this construct of power relations through, you could say, the American dollar, or through the concept of resource and the accumulation of resource as wealth building, right? So you actually have a profoundly, at the level of the social construct, at the level of the civilizational construct, profoundly empty, destitute, and broken meaning-making system in which this is the political reality, right? This is the everyday reality of the human being living within this macrocosmic system, which itself is doomed to either repetition or death, or a combination of the two, in which, without a real kind of spiritual evolution or revolution of consciousness, as in a transformation of the way of seeing or the paradigm of seeing and perception, this will continue onward forever. A new civilization will spring up from the death of the old, like the head of a hydra. So what baseball does and is doing, and again, to connect this explicitly with the historical material conditions of the destitute class, or the underclass, the political underclass, with the metaphysical power of baseball as a revelation of being, as described in the Hack-Wilson oration, is that we're looking at baseball as a cultural artifact, as in the means to perceive, or the means to see and to revelate this deeper essential underpinning of the will, as is elucidated in the metaphysical stories and gospels of Jesus Christ, as in the incarnation of the Godhead upon earth, and thus a ontological revelation of the grounds of being within a phenomenological reality, right? This is bringing into incarnation, into flesh, into form, the essential formlessness, or the utter formlessness, which informs all of reality and informs the totality and is the totality of being, but is not necessarily explicitly visible or made visible within the network of energetic movement, which is the greater currency of the universal exchange rate, so to speak, of all systems, the metabolic energy that courses through them, the thermonuclear energy that courses through them. So with the revelation of Hack-Wilson, again, we're witnessing this power emerge through political underclass individuals. This is a way of bringing into reality this revelation, not only as a narrativization, as in, let's say, a Bible story, or any other religious story which is communicated as allegory or communicated as a abstract sort of mythology. This is a revelation of those powers directly through the political underclass, which is to say a secular democratic form of the spiritual revelation of being in real time. To have this as a meaning-making system is profound, I'll say leagues or eons beyond the function, especially in terms of American history, of the church, which is to say the coming promise of revelation, right? As, let's say, as in the second coming, or the penance of life, which is repaid in death, as in heaven, right? These are all ways of saying it's a movement out of the present possibility for revelation, and thus self-realization and self-actualization, and a projection of that possibility into an unknown futurity, whether that, again, be death or the second coming of Christ. And we have to understand this as a greater political mechanism, as a functionary of the industrial capitalist system. It's a functionary of the political power mechanisms and systems which have transformed over time, again, starting with early feudalism, and perhaps even earlier on, if we were going to get more into the semantics and timelines and frameworks of how civilization itself as a construct emerges in terms of organizing and ordering, and thus attempting to control how resources form and are aggregated in semi-stable and local societies. We're looking at these very practical resourced power dynamics, which then themselves are scaled into empires of control and power and resource accumulation, and thus the projection of cultural systems, cultural images, cultural ideologies, and iconographies, which communicate implicitly and explicitly, depending on how closely one reads them, the impossibility of freedom or liberation for this political underclass, which must labor for the perennial glory, which is really nothing more than an economic and political position of power of the political overclass, which you could just call the elites of any civilization, or the organizing totalitarian forces of any civilization, which are to say they are in control of the means of the everyday. So this itself, again, is a war over the everyday, wherein the exploited class is crushed by the force of labor and labor extraction, which is necessarily the pending and ongoing state of any given civilization, particularly in a modern sense, American civilization, as a representative, kind of symbolic realization of the most extreme possible measures of whether to call it a culture of labor, or a culture of slavery, or a culture of exploitation, as in a society or a community or a nation or a civilizational construct functioning as a technological labor-producing and labor-reproducing machine, wherein all forces, all cultural artifacts, all cultural images are dedicated toward labor production, which is meant to generate outcomes. Again, we discussed this in relation to relationship itself, the possibility of humanity within these constructs, and thus the necessity of the political underclass essentially creating a grassroots method and mechanism through which to organize, to create relationship, to exist in relationship, and thus to actually have human experience. And this is something that is not native to civilization. It is not native to the production of a elite-generated reality construct or cultural construct. It is the opposite of culture in terms of a mutual or communal meaning-making mechanism through which to emerge the total powers of existence and realize the human being. It's rather a practical oppressive force, which is the culture of the elite system in a civilizational model, which is to say the elite culture itself is the creation of oppressive mechanisms to control the resource means in any given civilizational model. So this is actually what elite culture is at root and foundation. It's nothing more than the creation of control mechanisms, the creation of mechanisms through which to make more efficient and to more totally realize the productive force of labor, whether that's technological labor, whether that's physical labor, to produce material outcomes which can be absorbed and resorbed into the circulation of elite goods and currencies. And this itself is the culture therein of the elite class. So then we're looking at baseball foundationally. Let's see if I can pull this together here. Some of the things that Camus discusses in his relationship to, as they would call it in Europe, football. His most important teaching, his true university, which he says along with theater, which you could effectively say are the same thing, except for sport requires more immediate concentrated action to achieve a communal goal that has real imminent strategic relationship in it, right? Again, where in theater tends to be scripted, right? It's the scripted retelling or reproduction of a script. The flexibility required in sport, he says, football and theater are his two true universities. And he said the football fields of his youth were the ground on which he learned and he felt the possibility of something true and courageous and honorable and meaningful. And this is to speak a lot to specifically Camus' background as a deeply impoverished child, and the importance of the revelations that Camus states, specifically in terms of his philosophy of the absurd and the question of suicide in life, that to see that actually Camus' philosophical inquiry emerges directly from his political, social, and economic conditions as a member of the underclass who, in one way or another, is both gifted and pursues with the philosophical tradition, and thus achieves a level of recognition in his life for his works, but he is politically, historically, a member of this underclass who achieves some level of academic and social recognition, culminating in his Nobel Prize when he was in his 40s, I believe. So a lot of what is discussed in Camus is so incredibly important to what we're talking about here. This is not a discourse on Camus by any means, but it's to introduce him as a figure to understand the importance of his philosophical inquiry is derived directly from his political experience as an individual, right? Particularly in relationship with Algeria and France as a colonial subject. Algeria, where he's born as a white Frenchman. So what we have to look at more closely here is that relationship that Camus so clearly identifies as and with sport as a realm of possibility, which he observes as something it's almost extraterrestrial or beyond the political real, which avails him of a real possibility of human self-realization. And to have the cultural construct of, we can say sport in general, but again, to more specifically locate it in American early modern industrial history with baseball and the rise of importance of baseball, and to see these political subjects who themselves are not even subjects, they're more like political disjects in the sense that they do not exist. They are unnamed and unnumbered, and they're essentially, when they're born, they're already among the dead. They have no political stage, right? They have no stake. They have no wealth. They have no power in this kind of dirge of American civilization, which necessarily will rise and fall and consume itself with its own unacknowledged and unrecognized struggles with the essence and nature of the will. And again, the political struggle of civilization is the animal will coordinating itself through political power mechanisms and constructs, and all the while convincing itself that this is civilization or this is culture, wherein in reality the civilization and culture that emerges from these civilizations is actually from the political underclass, which retains and remains human and seeks meaning in the midst of this civilizational cultural mechanism, which has convinced itself that meaning and meaning making resides totally within power construct. Power control, power regulation, power manipulation, as in the manipulation of the surface level conditions and circumstances, as in a primal accumulation of resources and control of those resources. Right? So this is the great conflict of history and time in which the American political underclass rises as an underclass among historical underclasses, and itself creates this revolutionary phenomenology of baseball as democratic participation, and incorporates these essential philosophical characteristics such as self-overcoming and the integral function of the will in space and time to make manifest the capital W will, as in the essential will, the essence of the will in a cosmological sense, through these political disjects, which is to say those who have committed themselves devotionally to the act of baseball and have achieved through baseball a measure of economic security, however small, again, very much so like Camus with his pursuit of philosophy. And in doing so, they achieve that measure, and alongside with and beside that measure achieved, realize this massive disclosure on the field of the everyday, which wherein baseball is a church or a temple or a ritual or a rite that makes possible through the physical body the emergence and embodiment of these cosmological powers, and thus is the realm, so to speak, wherein the second coming is perennially here. Right, this is the making present the futurity of that which is promised to the working class, which is salvific. It's the salve of heaven, or the salve of the second coming of Christ. And what the second coming of Christ means, in the most real political sense, is that which, or the one who fights for the humanity of the most disjected or the repressed, the political underclass themselves. And that this is very clearly the historical allegory of Christ and what Christ represents in the political future of today. So when we look at this very directly, this is so important to see baseball as this cultural artifact created from below, which is then obviously attempted to be monopolized or industrialized or economized by the industrial titans of that day, such as people like Charles Ebbets, for instance, with the Brooklyn Dodgers. We're looking at this culture that is created and cultivated in a supra-agrarian sense, in the same way that you would have someone like Dizzy Dean as a sharecropper working the fields, or the history of the Black American slave. These people would be working the fields in a direct natural consequence, which is the consolidation of powers on a plantation or on a farm or in a factory or in the mines, which would then be siphoned upward to this industrial titan or the plantation owner or the slave owner or the farm owner. And therein, those labor powers would be resorbed by this cultural construct and force, which is quote-unquote civilization, which is it's not civilized at all whatsoever. It's a power mechanism, a power construct. But to raise this native power of baseball through the political underclass, again, across racial lines, however fraught, again, the necessity of the racial power construct in American history and civilization to maintain control over laboring bodies in space and time and use them to produce wealth for these elite individuals, so to speak, who are the civilizational lever pullers in the political construct of the everyday, in terms of how certain boundaries are juried and jurisdicted. To retain that labor force, which again is the thermodynamic, thermonuclear, entropic, metabolic power of the body, and to rededicate that toward the resolution and absolution of the human crisis and the human predicament in the act of baseball, through embodiment in the realization of the powers of the will upon this political, social, and cultural stage, which is the political culture of the underclass. Baseball itself, again, the importance of baseball to these larger communities, right? It's not just that Lefty Grove emerges from this community of miners in Maryland, or that Dizzy Dean emerges from this community of sharecroppers in the American South, or that Satchel Paige emerges from this community of ancestral slavery in the South. This is what's critical, right? Because these are not individual occurrences. The importance of baseball in these communal settings, particularly as it's well described in American history with the early immigrant mining communities, many of which observed different denominations of Christianity. Baseball itself would be the communal factor which would bring together and bind these communities across their denominational lines in a religious sense as a profound, higher organizing phenomenological reality of the spiritual constructs and concepts which would be articulated in a however democratic sense in these churches themselves through the various different ethnic turns or discriminations that would occur therein. This, again, is the larger organizing force of the humanistic and human question, the human condition, which is so clearly articulated through the process and ritual of baseball as a series of repetitive motions and gestures, which are the articulation of the possibility of the emergence of the cosmological will. That this itself is the greater spiritual existential force of the American proletariat, the American laboring political underclass, out from beneath and under this consolidated Rome of modern American civilization, which is to say the increasing constriction and totalization of political powers, as in labor and resource manipulation control, which is the practical political realm of the everyday, which is the culture of American civilization and American history at large, and the history of civilization at large. To see the true importance of the totalizing force and power of what is going on here, the necessity of baseball as an emergence and an increasing aesthetic sophistication of the powers of the will, which are then reclaimed by the political underclass and expressed in their fullest powers and their fullest nature to reveal this Christ quality, right? This Christ essence and Christ quality as the phenomenological revelation of the true and total essential powers of the will in a cosmological sense out from under the human being. This form of revelation itself being a profoundly liberatory and revolutionary culture at the level of human existence and human being and the question of human being. The question, the existential question, the incarnational question, which is so clearly, again, in the sense of Christ, present as the question of the past several thousands of years. To make that a phenomenological, practical, political, social, communal reality as a construct, a cultural construct, which is these different networks and enclaves of participation, all of which who are realizing and reproducing this sacral act of the ritual theater of baseball in Cuba, in the American South, in these small mining towns. And this is being aggregated into a professional league where these powers are being massively, totally realized, right? And shared upon this stage, this ritual communal stage. And this stage being progressively integrated, again with Jackie Robinson and Satchel Paige and Dizzy Dean, this stage being progressively integrated over time to become more and more and more possible in a deeper human sense out from under and beneath these denominational lines, which are really control mechanisms to siphon and control inflows and outflows of power, as in labor, as in resource, as in political control at the level of civilization. This is a revelation of the deeper ontology of human being, as in the cosmological essential powers of the will, rising up from beneath in a proletarian sense, in a communal sense, in a true native grassroots cultural sense, which is itself the revolutionary political mechanism out from under the entire apparatus and construct of power relation, which is American civilization and the history of civilization itself, which is revolutionizing in terms of phenomenological awareness and realization of consciousness, the possibilities and powers of the human being, which are then themselves that very revolutionary force which is irrevocably altering, changing, shifting, breaking this civilizational mechanism through consciousness, through mass communal awareness of what is possible and what is true, out from beneath and under the institutionalized ideological concepts and constructs, including quite clearly the religious ones, which are doctrinal and indoctrinal forces which are removing and attempting to dislocate and discommunicate the possible evolutionary and revolutionary powers of the present and to dislocate them and throw them into the future. Again, in terms of heaven or the second coming, a movement away from the freedom and possibility, the evolutionary existential possibility of the individual, particularly the proletarian individual, in the present moment, and to throw that possibility into a pending future, predicated upon obedience to these constructs. So again, you can see the profound spiritual and psychic power of baseball as a force of emerging political consciousness, revolutionary consciousness, and deeply spiritual consciousness in the realm of the secular, wherein the baseball field appears to be a theater, where in actuality it's a church of the realization of the powers of the Godhead. And to return this so fully and thoroughly and natively to the political underclass, and to have that political underclass be participating and in participation together across perceived boundaries, especially racial boundaries, again, right, which are the hallmark, the institutionalized hallmark of political power and civilizations, which is to say this group of people is inhuman because they appear to be XYZ, or they have this XYZ characteristic. This is a primordial force of unification out from under civilization, which breaks this historical somnambulistic overturning in the cyclical nature of empires and the forces of power constructs and civilizations, because it is a native culture to the underclass. And in this nativity, it is in a profoundly unconscious and intuitive way bringing about the wholeness and fullness of the powers of the human being, precisely because it is dedicated existentially toward the human being. It's not dedicated toward the control of external circumstances, as in power relations, as in resource accumulation and manipulation of laboring bodies, which again is an abstraction and a dissociation from the real terms and the real human questions articulated so clearly in the historical works of Camus. But in doing so, the elite class and the culture of the elite class is profoundly inhuman and never actually confronts the real existential questions that constitute human being and being human. Wherein, this is to say, where Camus and Diogenes have such a profound relationship in the understanding, Camus more so in terms of the total circumstances and arc of his biography, that the existential human question emerges from a profound nakedness and a facing of the truth of being, which is nowhere present in the elite systems of control and production and reproduction as a political power movement, which is the maintenance of the order of civilization. It's not meant to be. And this is the real crux of a native culture of the political underclass. Because the question of humanity is so pressing, it's so existentially pressing, because the political everyday, in one way or another, has entirely pushed out the possibility of being human, or even the possibility of comfort. So this is a real existential force whose question is so incredibly strong, and again is so realized in the 20th century, mid-century circumstance of Camus himself as a figure and a figurehead for this revelation in a modern industrial world. This question is so strong and so pressing. It is the question of the everyday. It's the question that's being asked in every laboring moment, in every cyclical constriction of the humanity of the political subject of the underclass itself, which is being made into laboring body, as is so clearly theorized in Marx's most immersive works. He's understanding that the humanity is actively being removed from the political situation, and the ordering powers of the human being are being siphoned entirely into production of labor force, right? And so to redirect that historical organizational power, which is the civilizational power of history itself, to redirect it and reallocate it toward a cultural artifact which is profoundly away from this jurisdiction of the everyday as a practical control mechanism for labor and resources, right? To redirect it towards a celebratory revelation of the emergence of the cosmological will is itself a profoundly liberating, revolutionary force in history, which is a reclaiming fundamentally of the human being toward itself, and thus the realization of the powers of humanity towards humanity itself. So this, again, cannot be understated. This is more than a cultural artifact. It's the possibility of existential revelation in real time, in history, in space, and in time, out from under these profoundly oppressive historical forces of civilizational history, which seek to oppress and subjugate and institute divisional ideological lines within this larger milieu of the political underclass, including religious lines, to subvert and control and essentially remove the human question, because the human question is not being confronted anywhere within elite culture, because elite culture has removed itself from the human question. Elite culture has never attempted the human question. Elite culture is so predicated in and preoccupied with control and power as a solution to the existential crisis of being human, that when we observe the larger churn of a democratic history of philosophy, which is to say, again with Camus, is very profoundly unacademic. It's more of a literary or a lecture or a speech, wherein Camus says several times, I'm not here to give a lecture. I'm not here to give anything. I'm here to communicate this essential question, and to ask this question, and to ask it with you. Again, this is a demos, right? This is an inclusive sphere of the existential question of being human, which is particular to the political underclass, and most clearly realized in the sphere of athletics, and particularly baseball in American history, in this specific kind of locality that we are inquiring into in order to ground this inquiry, this phenomenological existential inquiry of being human, and the consequences therein. So to have this emerge is of the utmost and absolute essence, because it returns us to our essence. It returns us to our existential question within the realm of cultural and political theater, presence of the body, embodied, incarnate, awareness, inquiry in the realm of the everyday, to pursue this revelation and to realize it within ourselves as ourselves, time and time again, deeper and deeper, and thus to be profoundly more so rooted within human purpose, human meaning, and human being itself. Even amidst and out from this historical condition of profound oppression, which is the history of civilizations and the necessity of the creation of the political underclass within civilizations to control, create, produce, and reproduce the means unto power, political power. This is what we observe historically on the stage of humanity, which is recorded in the record books, which is, as we discussed in the last essay, a meaningless and useless history, which is just a dirge and a lament of the same. This is not a creative or constructive historical force. This is a historical force which is a game of possession and control of the very things which themselves have no particular meaning other than to create the conditions for the possibility of revelation, which is to say, all of the things that political power occupies itself with, money or the symbolic currency of human beings as a proxy toward the possibility for creating material conditions, which then the question remains existentially, what meaning is possible within the framework of the human being? So this is political historical nonsense, which is profoundly based in an evolutionary trauma and fear of death, right? Fear of the impossibility of survival, which again is still not getting us to the existential question of what does it mean to be. And this is what Camus so clearly addresses in his question. The question of suicide is the only question of human being. We need to go far beyond life and death to grasp the powers of the real, as in the emergence, the phenomenological emergence of the existential will, the cosmological will, through human being as a vessel, as a channel, as a way of seeing, perceiving, and being that will incarnate in space and time, which again is the Christ Godhead dynamic, as in the incarnation of the whole, the cosmological whole of the force of will, of the universe of being itself. This is the real task. This is the embodied existential incarnate task of being human. And to return humanity to that is necessarily to subvert the entire history of civilization, the entire nonsense of the political dirge and lament of control and power, and the dehumanization of the laboring body in the modern industrial complex of production and consumption. This is all as it would be said in the Hindu sense, a wheel of karma, ever reproducing, repeating phenomenological recurrence, which must be broken as a somnambulistic spell as we reach out toward the true object of history, which is the transcendental total realization of the powers. That material historical reality is an essential springboard into the eternal. So that's what I got. I'll catch you on the next one.